When my boyfriend, Luke, told me he had cut ties with his family, he called it necessary for his survival. I thought he was being dramatic. Years later, I decided to reach out to them behind his back, thinking my son deserved a grandfather. But when Luke found out and revealed the full extent of their brutal abuse, my world came crashing down. Now I've lost him, and I regret everything. When I first met Luke, it was clear he carried a weight that most people didn't. He was open and loving with me, but noticeably guarded whenever the topic of his family came up. "My family isn't in the picture," he said during one of our early dates, his tone leaving no room for further questions. Over time, as our relationship deepened, he opened up a little more. He told me he had gone no contact with his parents and siblings years ago, describing their relationship as toxic and unbearable. "It was the only way I could survive," he said quietly one night, his eyes fixed on the floor. I didn't push for details. We were happy, and I didn't see the need to dig into wounds he clearly wanted to leave in the past. I figured if it was important, he would tell me when he was ready. Things changed when our son, Max, was born. Becoming a parent opened up a whole new perspective for me. Watching Max take his first steps, say his first words, and discover the world made me nostalgic for my own childhood. I had grown up surrounded by family, grandparents who spoiled me, aunts and uncles who cheered me on, cousins who were like siblings. But Max didn't have that. Luke's family was non-existent, and my own parents lived far away, visiting only once or twice a year. The thought of Max growing up without grandparents began to bother me. I wanted him to experience the same kind of unconditional love and support I had as a child. I brought it up to Luke one evening as we watched Max toddle around the living room. "Have you ever thought about reconnecting with your family?" I asked cautiously. Luke's jaw tightened, and he shook his head without hesitation.
"No.
"And I don't want Max anywhere near them." "Why not?" I pressed gently. "People change, Luke. Maybe they've softened with time." He turned to me, his expression dark. "You don't understand. My father is a monster. That's not something time fixes." But I couldn't let it go. Luke's words felt too absolute, too final. In my mind, people could change. Families fought, but they also healed. I had always believed that no matter how bad things got, family could find a way back to each other. I started wondering if Luke's decision to cut ties had been hasty, made in the heat of youthful emotions. What if things were different now? What if his family regretted what happened and wanted to make amends, but didn't know how to reach him? One night, as I was scrolling through social media, a thought struck me. What if I reached out to them? Luke didn't need to know, at least not right away. If I made contact and they turned out to be as terrible as Luke claimed, I could drop it and never bring it up again. But if they seemed open to reconciling, I could create an opportunity for Max to have the grandparents I felt he deserved. I hesitated, knowing this would go against Luke's wishes. But I convinced myself I was doing the right thing. This wasn't just about Luke, it was about Max. People change, I told myself. They deserve a chance to show they've grown. With my mind made up, I began searching for Luke's family online, not realizing the storm I was about to unleash. Once the decision was made, I couldn't shake the feeling of both nervousness and anticipation. It wasn't difficult to find Luke's father, Richard, online. A quick search of his name led me straight to his public social media profile. Scrolling through his posts, I was surprised by what I saw. Richard appeared to be a doting grandfather to other children. Pictures of family barbecues, outings to the park, and candid moments with smiling kids filled his profile. His captions were full of warmth and pride, talking about the joys of family and the importance of cherishing every moment. This didn't match the image Luke had painted. Richard didn't look like a monster to me. He looked like the kind of grandfather any child would be lucky to have. Despite my lingering doubts, I crafted a cautious message. "Hello, Richard," I wrote, my fingers trembling as I typed. "My name is my name, and I'm Luke's partner. I know it's been a long time since you've been in touch with him, but I thought you should know that he has a son now. His name is Max, and he's a wonderful little boy. I don't want to overstep, but I thought it might be time to reconnect. Let me know if you'd be open to talking." I sent the message, my heart racing as I stared at the screen. A part of me expected no response. After all, if Luke had been right about his father, Richard might ignore me or react angrily. But another part of me held on to hope. Less than a day later, my phone pinged with a notification. Richard had responded. His tone was warm and eager, nothing like what I'd feared. "Thank you so much for reaching out," he wrote. "We've missed Luke so much, and it breaks my heart that he cut us off. I've always wondered if I did something wrong, but I never got the chance to fix it. We'd love to meet you and our grandson. Family means everything to me. His message struck a chord. He didn't seem like someone who would deliberately hurt his son. Instead, he sounded like a man full of regret, longing for a second chance. As we exchanged a few more messages, Richard shared stories about Luke's childhood, things I'd never heard before. He talked about how proud he was when Luke got his first job, how they used to bond over fishing trips, and how devastated he was when Luke cut ties. His sincerity caught me off guard. Had Luke misjudged him? Or had something small snowballed into years of estrangement? I couldn't help but wonder if this was a case of misunderstandings that had festered over time. People change, I reminded myself. Maybe Richard wasn't the same person Luke remembered. I think Max would love to meet his grandfather, I wrote cautiously. Maybe we could arrange something casual, like a park visit? Richard agreed enthusiastically, and we set a date for the following weekend. As I finalized the plans, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was doing the right thing. Max deserved to have family in his life, and Richard seemed genuinely remorseful about the past. At the same time, I couldn't help feeling a twinge of guilt. I knew Luke wouldn't approve if he found out, but I convinced myself it was worth the risk. For Max's sake, this was a chance worth taking, or so I thought. The day of the meeting arrived, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and excitement as I packed a bag for Max. I had chosen a nearby park for its casual atmosphere, hoping the open space and play equipment would keep things light and comfortable. Max was blissfully unaware of the weight of the occasion. To him, it was just another outing to the park, complete with his favorite snacks and toys. But for me, it was a chance to bridge a gap I hadn't created, but felt compelled to mend. When we arrived, Richard was already there, sitting on a bench with a bag of toys at his feet. He stood up the moment he saw us, his broad smile making him look every bit the friendly grandfather I'd hoped he would be. "Max, this is your grandfather," I said gently, crouching beside my son. Richard knelt down, his eyes softening as he took in Max's tiny frame and curious eyes. "Hey there, buddy," he said warmly, holding out a small toy truck. Max's face lit up, and within seconds, he was babbling excitedly about his love for cars, clutching the truck like it was the best thing he'd ever seen. Watching them interact was both heartwarming and surreal. Richard's enthusiasm seemed genuine, and Max, always quick to sense a person's mood, warmed up to him immediately. They played together on the grass, Max giggling as Richard pushed him on the swings and helped him build castles in the sandbox. As I watched from a nearby bench, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. This was exactly what I'd envisioned, a happy, supportive family moment for Max. Once Max was engrossed in digging holes with his new toy truck, Richard sat down beside me. His expression grew more serious, his earlier cheer giving way to a somber tone. "Thank you for this," he said quietly. "I can't tell you how much it means to me. I never thought I'd get the chance to meet my grandson." "Luke hasn't shared much about what happened," I said carefully, hoping to nudge the conversation without pushing too hard. "I just want to understand. Maybe there's a way to fix things." Richard sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "I don't know what Luke's told you, but I'll admit I wasn't a perfect father. I made mistakes, big ones. I was strict, maybe too strict at times, and we fought a lot when he was growing up. But I never stopped loving him." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I think I pushed him too hard. I wanted him to succeed, to have the life I didn't, but I didn't know how to show it the right way. I regret it every day." His eyes grew misty as he glanced over at Max, who was now attempting to climb the slide. "I've missed so much," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Birthdays, holidays, years of his life. And it's my fault. I don't blame him for cutting me off, but I'd give anything to make things right." His words struck a chord with me. He didn't sound offensive or dismissive, just regretful. It was hard to reconcile this vulnerable man with the harsh monster Luke had described. By the time we left the park, I felt conflicted but hopeful. Richard had been nothing but kind and genuine during our meeting, and Max had adored him. I couldn't see any trace of the abusive figure Luke had painted, and I started to wonder if Luke's decision to cut ties had been too harsh. As I drove home, I couldn't help but feel like I'd done the right thing. Max had a grandfather now, and maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something positive for all of us. But as much as I wanted to believe in the possibility of reconciliation, I had no idea how drastically everything was about to unravel. I knew I couldn't keep the meeting with Richard a secret forever, but I wasn't ready to tell Luke. I convinced myself that I was waiting for the right time, a moment when I could carefully explain my intentions without triggering his anger. But time had a way of slipping past, and before I knew it, Weeks had gone by. Richard had sent me a few messages during that time, thanking me again for the opportunity to meet Max and expressing his hope that we could continue building a connection. I hadn't responded much, torn between the guilt of going behind Luke's back and the feeling that I'd done something good for Max. And then, one evening, everything fell apart. It happened so quickly, I didn't even have time to prepare. I was in the kitchen making dinner while Luke scrolled through my phone, looking for a recipe I'd saved. It wasn't unusual. Our phones were often left lying around, and we had nothing to hide. Or so I thought. "Who's this?" Luke's voice cut through the hum of the kitchen, calm but icy. I turned to see him holding up my phone, the screen displaying a picture I had taken at the park, Max grinning ear to ear as Richard pushed him on the swings. My stomach dropped. "Luke, I started," my words faltering under his piercing gaze. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "What is this?" he repeated, his tone sharper this time. I tried to explain, stumbling over my words. I thought Max deserved to have a grandfather. I wanted to see if they'd changed. His calm exterior shattered in an instant. "You had no right," he snapped, his voice rising with anger. "You have no idea what you've done." The anger in his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from him before. Luke was always the level-headed one in our relationship, the one who rarely raised his voice or let his emotions get the better of him. But this was different. "I told you to leave them alone," he said, pacing the room as he ran a hand through his hair. "I told you what my father was like, and you still went behind my back. Do you even understand what you've done?" "Luke, I wasn't trying to hurt you," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "I thought maybe they'd changed. Your dad seemed so genuine, so kind. I wanted Max to have..." "To have what?" he interrupted, his voice cutting me off. "A relationship with the man who destroyed my childhood? The man who beat me, humiliated me, and made me feel like I was nothing? Is that what you wanted for our son?" His words hit me like a freight train. I had known Luke's relationship with his father was bad, but I hadn't realized just how deep the scars went. "I didn't know," I said weakly, my voice trembling. "You never told me." "Because it's not something I wanted to relive," he shouted. "I trusted you to respect that, and you went behind my back like it didn't matter." The weight of his words crushed me. I'd convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that I was acting in Max's best interests, but now I wasn't so sure. Had I been blinded by my own ideals of family, ignoring the reality of Luke's pain? "I thought I was helping," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to betray you." Luke let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Helping? Do you know what it's like to see that picture? To know you introduced my son to the man I spent my entire life trying to escape?" I had no answer. All I could do was stand there, the weight of my guilt settling over me like a suffocating blanket. The rest of the night was a blur. Luke left the room, slamming the bedroom door behind him, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I wanted to chase after him, to explain myself better, but I didn't know what to say. As I sat on the couch, staring at the picture on my phone, I realized just how deeply I had miscalculated. Luke's pain wasn't something that time could erase, or that I could fix with a single meeting. I had made a decision that wasn't mine to make, and now, the cracks in our relationship were more visible than ever. That night, the air in our home was heavy with silence. Luke stayed in the bedroom while I sat in the living room, the weight of guilt pressing down on me like a boulder. I replayed the confrontation over and over in my mind, my stomach twisting with each passing thought. Eventually, Luke emerged, his face pale and drawn. He didn't look at me as he sat down on the opposite end of the couch. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, without warning, he began to talk. "It wasn't just fights or arguments," he said, his voice low but steady. "My father wasn't some strict disciplinarian trying to do his best. He was an abuser, a manipulative, cruel man who thrived on making us feel small." I didn't interrupt. I didn't dare. "There were nights," he continued, his voice cracking slightly, "when I'd sleep in the car just to get away from him. Even in the dead of winter, it felt safer than staying under the same roof as him. He'd come home from work angry at the world, and we were his punching bags, literally." I felt my throat tighten as he spoke, the vivid images forming in my mind. "He beat me until I couldn't stand," Luke said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'd curl up on the floor, trying to make myself as small as possible, and he'd still find a way to hit me. He told me I was worthless, that I'd never amount to anything. And the worst part? My mother and siblings just stood by and let it happen. I wanted to say something, anything, to comfort him, but no words came. What could I possibly say in the face of such pain? Luke took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he continued. I spent years thinking it was my fault. That if I could just be better, smarter, more obedient, maybe he'd stop. But he didn't. He only got worse. And when I finally realized it wasn't going to change, I left. I cut them all off because I knew I'd never be able to heal if I stayed. Tears streamed down my face as I listened, each word hitting me like a punch to the gut. I had thought I was helping, but I had been so blind to the depth of his trauma. And now, he said, his voice rising with anger, you've brought our son into his life. The same man who destroyed my childhood. The same man I've spent years trying to escape. Do you have any idea what you've done? I didn't know, I whispered, my voice trembling. Because you didn't ask. Luke snapped. You didn't believe me when I told you he was a monster. You thought you knew better, and now you've reopened every wound I've spent years trying to close. The raw emotion in his voice broke something inside me. He was right. I hadn't truly believed him. I had dismissed his warnings as overreactions, convincing myself that I knew what was best for Max without fully understanding the depth of Luke's pain. I thought I was helping, I said, my voice barely audible. I thought people could change. Not him, Luke said firmly. Not someone like him. The room fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over us like a thick fog. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but I knew it wasn't the time. Luke stood up, running a hand through his hair as he paced the room. I need time, he said finally. I can't do this right now. And with that, he walked out the door, leaving me alone with the crushing realization of what I had done. That night, I lay awake, haunted by Luke's words. I thought about Max, about the innocent trust in his eyes as he played with Richard at the park. I thought about the stories Richard had told me, the picture of regret and warmth he had painted. And then I thought about the version of Richard Luke had described, the monster behind the mask. I had wanted so badly to believe in the idea of family, in the possibility of reconciliation, that I had ignored the most important person in my life. Now, I didn't know if I'd ever be able to fix what I'd broken. The days after Luke left felt like I was moving through a fog. Nothing felt real, his absence, the heavy silence in our home, the weight of my own guilt pressing down on me. Max, too young to understand the complexity of what had happened, toddled around the house, his innocent laughter a painful contrast to the tension that had shattered our family. Luke had packed a small bag and left the same night he'd shared the truth about his father. I need space, he'd said flatly, his eyes red from a mix of anger and exhaustion. I didn't stop him. What could I say that wouldn't sound hollow after what I'd done? Without him there, the house felt suffocatingly empty. I replayed our argument over and over in my mind, analyzing every word, every missed sign, every moment where I could have chosen to trust him but didn't. Richard called once during that time, the cheerful tone in his voice starkly out of place. I just wanted to check in, he said. Max is such a bright little boy. When can I see him again? Hearing his voice sent a chill down my spine. The warmth I'd once found reassuring now felt manipulative. I stared at my phone, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. I don't think that's a good idea right now, I said finally, my voice shaky. He paused, his tone hardening slightly. I thought we had a good thing going here, he said. You saw for yourself how much I care. Don't let Luke's bitterness ruin this for Max. That sentence was like a slap in the face. I ended the call quickly, feeling a wave of nausea. How could someone speak so casually about bitterness when Luke's words about his childhood were still ringing in my ears? For the first time, I saw Richard through Luke's eyes, not as the doting grandfather he'd presented himself to be, but as someone who might be capable of hiding darker truths beneath a charming exterior. When Luke finally returned days later, I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. His face was expressionless as he walked through the door, his movements mechanical as he set his bag down by the couch. Luke, I began, taking a tentative step toward him. He held up a hand, cutting me off. Don't, he said, his tone cold and detached. I'm here for Max, not for us. His words felt like a punch to the gut, but I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. We sat down that evening after Max had gone to bed, the space between us on the couch feeling like a canyon. Luke stared at the floor for a long time before finally speaking. I've been thinking about this nonstop, he said. Trying to figure out how you could do something like this after everything I told you. I opened my mouth to respond, but he continued, his voice rising slightly. You prioritized your version of a happy family over my safety and our sons. You thought you knew better, even after I warned you. I didn't understand, I said, tears streaming down my face. I thought I was helping. I thought people could change. And that's the problem, Luke said, his tone sharp. You thought. You didn't listen to me. You didn't trust me. And now, I don't know if I can trust you anymore. His words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. I wanted to plead with him, to beg for forgiveness, but I knew it wouldn't help. Luke stood, running a hand through his hair. I need time to figure out what this means for us, he said. Right now, I don't know if I can look at you the same way. As he walked away, the weight of my actions hit me all over again. I had been so focused on what I thought was best for Max that I had ignored the person who should have mattered most. Now, I was left alone with the pieces of our relationship, unsure if they could ever be put back together. After Luke left, guilt became a constant companion, gnawing at me with every passing moment. I couldn't escape the overwhelming weight of what I'd done. I had betrayed Luke in a way that cut deeper than I'd realized at the time. I thought I was acting in Max's best interest, but I hadn't stopped to consider the cost, not just to Luke, but to our family as a whole. Every corner of the house felt emptier, without Luke there. The nights were the worst, as I lay awake replaying every mistake I'd made. I had ignored Luke's pain, dismissed his warnings, and in doing so, I had reopened wounds he'd spent years trying to heal. And then there was Max explaining to him why Luke wasn't coming home was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Daddy's just staying with a friend for a little while, I said, forcing a smile. But his wide, questioning eyes broke my heart. He didn't understand why his world had suddenly changed, and I had no one to blame but myself. I tried reaching out to Luke multiple times, but every call and message went unanswered. My apologies felt hollow even to me. What could I possibly say to make him understand that I hadn't meant to hurt him? That I'd acted out of ignorance, not malice? Finally, after days of silence, Luke answered one of my calls. His voice was distant, his words deliberate. What do you want? He asked, and I could hear the exhaustion in his tone. I wanted to say I'm sorry, I said, my voice trembling. I didn't realize how much pain I'd cause. I wasn't trying to betray you. I thought I was helping. Luke sighed heavily. You thought you were helping, he repeated, his voice laced with bitterness. Do you even hear yourself? You ignored everything I told you. You put Max in danger because you thought you knew better. How am I supposed to forgive that? His words hit me like a slap in the face. I wanted to argue, to explain my side, but I knew he was right. I had dismissed his trauma as something that could be healed with time, as if years of abuse could be erased with a single meeting. I don't know if I can forgive this, Luke continued, his voice softening slightly. You reopened wounds I've spent years trying to heal. Do you have any idea how that feels? Tears streamed down my face as I listened, the full weight of his pain sinking in. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice cracking. I know that's not enough, but I don't know what else to say. I need time, Luke said after a long pause. Time to figure out what this means for me, for us. Right now, I can't do this. After that call, I realized I had to face the reality of what I'd done. Apologies wouldn't fix this. I couldn't undo the hurt I'd caused or erase the betrayal Luke felt. I started reflecting on the choices I'd made and the assumptions I'd held. Why had I been so quick to dismiss Luke's pain? Why had I believed that I knew better than he did about his own family? The answer, I realized, was rooted in my own idealized view of family. I had grown up with loving grandparents, and I wanted the same for Max. I had convinced myself that family bonds could withstand anything, that people could change, and that reconciliation was always possible. But that wasn't Luke's reality. His family wasn't mine, and his experiences weren't something I could rewrite to fit my own narrative. I had ignored his truth because it didn't align with what I wanted to believe, and now, we were all paying the price. The hardest part wasn't facing Luke's anger, it was facing my own reflection. I had let my own naivety and arrogance destroy the trust that was the foundation of our relationship. Now, all I could do was hope that someday, Luke would find it in his heart to forgive me. In the weeks that followed, the enormity of my mistake became painfully clear. I had convinced myself that I was acting in Max's best interest, but the truth was far less noble. I hadn't respected Luke's boundaries, dismissed his pain, and placed my own desire for an ideal family above the reality of his trauma. Every time I replayed my interactions with Richard, I felt a knot in my stomach. His charm, his warmth, his seemingly genuine regret, It had all seemed so convincing. I had wanted to believe that people could change, that time could soften even the hardest hearts. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how easily I'd been fooled. Richard had shown me the version of himself he wanted me to see. He hadn't mentioned the abuse Luke had described, hadn't acknowledged the harm he'd caused beyond vague references to mistakes. And I had taken his words at face value because they aligned with the narrative I wanted to believe. As I dug deeper into my own motivations, I began to understand just how much my own experiences had clouded my judgment. I had grown up in a close-knit family where disagreements were resolved quickly and love was unconditional. I had assumed that Luke's family must have the same potential for reconciliation. But Luke's reality was entirely different. His childhood had been marked by fear, control, and cruelty. His decision to cut ties wasn't a rash reaction, it was an act of survival. By ignoring that, I had betrayed him in the most profound way. It wasn't just Richard's charm that had blinded me, it was my own refusal to accept that some people don't change, that some wounds are too deep to heal with time. The guilt was suffocating, but it also became a catalyst for growth. I knew I couldn't undo what I'd done, but I could try to understand why I'd made those choices and ensure I didn't repeat them. I decided to start therapy, hoping to confront the patterns and assumptions that had led me to this point. My first session was nerve-wracking, but as I sat across from the therapist, I felt a glimmer of hope that this could help me become better, not just for myself, but for Max and, hopefully, for Luke. I wanted to fix things, I admitted during that first session. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I ended up making everything worse. I don't understand how I could have been so blind. The therapist listened patiently before responding. It sounds like you were trying to force an ideal onto a situation that didn't fit. Recognizing that is the first step toward growth. The sessions became a space where I could untangle my thoughts and begin to make sense of my actions. I explored the ways my own upbringing had shaped my views on family, the pressure I'd placed on myself to create the perfect life for Max, and the deeper insecurities that had led me to ignore Luke's boundaries. Therapy didn't provide instant answers, but it helped me see the bigger picture. I began to understand how deeply I'd underestimated the impact of trauma, how easily abusers can manipulate perception, and how important it is to listen and trust the people you love. Most importantly, I learned to take responsibility for my actions without drowning in shame. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose to grow from it. Richard, meanwhile, hadn't reached out again, and I was relieved. His silence only reinforced the idea that his earlier warmth had been a performance, carefully tailored to draw me in. I shuddered at the thought of what might have happened if I'd allowed him more access to Max. As I continued to work on myself, I held on to a sliver of hope that Luke might someday see the effort I was making. But I knew better than to expect forgiveness, or even reconciliation. For now, all I could do was focus on becoming a better person and a better mother. The bigger picture was clear. I had to stop trying to force my version of happiness onto others and start respecting the truths they carried. It was a hard lesson to learn, but one I wouldn't forget. Months passed before Luke and I sat down face to face. It was in a small coffee shop near his new apartment, a neutral space that felt less charged than the home we had once shared. I hadn't pushed for this meeting. Luke had reached out, suggesting it when he felt ready. Walking into the cafe, my stomach churned with nerves. I wasn't sure what to expect. Luke was already seated at a corner table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug. His expression was calm but guarded, and I could tell he had prepared himself for this conversation as much as I had. "Thanks for meeting me," I said, sliding into the chair across from him. He nodded, his eyes scanning my face. "I thought it was time," he said simply. For the first few minutes, the conversation was stilted, full of polite pleasantries about Max and his recent milestones. Luke smiled faintly when I told him how much Max had been talking about his daddy, but the weight of the real discussion hung heavily between us. Finally, I took a deep breath and broke the tension. "Luke, I know I've apologized before, but I need to say it again. I'm so sorry for what I did. I should have listened to you. I should have trusted you." Luke set his mug down, his expression unreadable. "I believe you're sorry," he said after a long pause. "But sorry doesn't fix the damage. It doesn't erase what happened." "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm working on myself. I've started therapy trying to understand why I made the choices I did. I know it doesn't change what I did to you, but I'm trying to be better, for Max, for myself, and for you if you'll let me." Luke sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I still care about you," he admitted. "You're the mother of my son, and we've shared a lot. But things can't go back to the way they were. Trust takes time, and right now, I don't know if I'm ready to give that to you. His words stung, but I appreciated his honesty. I understand, I said softly. I'm not asking for things to go back to the way they were. I just want to make sure we're doing right by Max. He deserves the best of both of us, even if we're not together. Luke nodded, his eyes softening slightly. He does. And I want him to grow up knowing how much we both love him. That's what matters most. We spent the rest of the meeting discussing co-parenting arrangements. Luke wanted to be more involved in Max's daily life, and I was more than willing to accommodate that. We agreed on a schedule that allowed Max to spend plenty of time with both of us, and we promised to keep communication open for his sake. As I left the cafe, I felt a mix of emotions. It wasn't the reconciliation I had hoped for, but it was a step forward. Luke was willing to work with me to give Max a happy, stable life, and that was something I could be grateful for. In the days that followed, we began to navigate our new roles as co-parents. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of tension, old wounds that hadn't fully healed, but we both kept our focus on Max. Slowly but surely, I began to feel a sense of hope. While I couldn't undo the past, I could work toward a better future for our son. And maybe, with time, Luke and I could find a way to rebuild the trust that had been broken. It wasn't the ending I'd envisioned, but it was a new beginning. And for now, that was enough. The path to moving forward has been anything but smooth, but it's one I've had to walk, step by painful step. Today, I'm still learning to forgive myself for the choices I made and the hurt I caused. Losing Luke as a partner was one of the hardest lessons I've ever had to face. Yet it also forced me to confront my own flaws and grow in ways I never thought possible. Max has been my anchor through it all. His laughter, his curious questions, and his boundless energy remind me every day of what truly matters. I've poured myself into creating a stable, loving environment for him, even if it looks different from the life I once imagined. Luke is still part of our lives. Our relationship may not be what it once was, but it's built on something just as important: mutual respect and a shared love for our son. We've learned to communicate better, setting aside our personal differences for Max's sake. Co-parenting with Luke has been a journey in itself. At first, our interactions were stiff and strained, the wounds of our past too fresh to ignore. But over time, we found a rhythm. We focused on Max, his needs, his milestones, his happiness. When Max started preschool, we both showed up for his first day, standing side by side as he nervously walked into the classroom. When he had his first soccer game, we cheered him on from the sidelines together. These small moments, though bittersweet, have reminded me that even in the aftermath of our mistakes, we can still build something meaningful. Luke has been cautious about letting me back into his trust, and I understand why. I don't push for more than he's willing to give. Instead, I focus on proving through my actions that I've learned from my mistakes. One of the biggest lessons I've taken from all of this is the importance of boundaries. I used to think that love meant doing whatever you could to fix things, even if it meant crossing lines that weren't yours to cross. But I've learned that respecting someone's boundaries is one of the purest forms of love. I also understand now that listening is more than just hearing words. It's believing and honoring the experiences of the people we care about. I didn't do that with Luke when he told me about his family, and it cost me more than I ever thought it would. There are days when I still feel the sting of regret, moments when I wish I could go back and do things differently. But I've learned that dwelling on the past doesn't change it. What matters is what I do now, how I show up for Max, how I work with Luke, and how I continue to grow. Looking back, I know I'll never forget the mistakes I made. They've left scars that will always remind me of what I lost. But those scars have also taught me lessons I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Max deserves a happy, stable life, and I'm doing everything I can to provide that for him. I'm not the same person I was when this all began, and while I still have a lot of work to do, I'm proud of how far I've come. For now, this is enough. A life of love, growth, and learning, one step at a time.